Okay, welcome everyone to ARTIVISM, the Power of Art for Social Transformation. We are currently halfway through Season 8. This presentation is being recorded and will be added to ARTIVISM's YouTube channel, ARTIVISM for Shared Humanity for Educational Purposes. The mission of this interdisciplinary, multi-institutional collaboration is to engage people in changing society through the power of art. The vision of ARTIVISM, the power of art for social transformation, is to generate a movement with committed social artivists in response to historic global unrest. ARTIVISM aims to generate community through multidisciplinary teamwork. The goal of this initiative is to nurture change for a more dignified and meaningful coexistence. Today's artivist is Shariann Lewitt. Shariann is the author of 17 novels under 5 different names, spanning the genres of hard science fiction, fantasy, and young adult. Her short fiction has been widely published, and her story, Fieldwork, was selected for 34th Best Science Fiction of the Year, edited by Gardner Dozois. A third-generation Manhattanite, Lewitt moved to the greater Boston area in 2000 and has become a proud citizen of the Red Sox Nation. She dropped out of pre-law to study evolutionary population biology in college because law school looked dismal and she was afraid of fainting in bio lab like she did in high school. She did her graduate work at Yale and never returned to live in New York City. When not writing in local coffee shops, she teaches at MIT, plays with her pet parrots, and travels as widely as possible. Welcome, Shariann.
Thank you so much, Argy. Well, one of the things I don't put in the official biography is that I have been an activist since the age of 16. I joined a leftist Trotskyite party in New York City, which kicked me out when it became very clear that I was not going to completely abandon my academic career. So, and I have been, they kicked me out, but I didn't change my mind very much. Although I have moved even somewhat further to the left, and I now consider myself more of a social anarchist than a strict Trotskyite. And I've been active in various organizations ever since, and I do spend some of my time on outdoors, on picket lines, in demonstrations, etc. And one of my favorite reviews and taglines that I've ever gotten was being called, oh, now I forget. But, anyway, so this is kind of a natural for me. When I found out that the CIA had been involved in the Iowa Writers' Workshop, you could have picked me up off the floor. I was absolutely, I can't even, shock doesn't begin to describe it. Now, to understand, Iowa Writers' Workshop is the first and most prestigious of all of the MFA programs in the US. Well, it's no longer the most, but it's still among like the top 5. And this article that came out in 2015, Chronicle of Higher Education, February 10th, 2014, by Eric Bennett. Title is, Did Iowa Flatten American Literature? I don't think Bennett really meant the article to do what it did. Bennett was really writing this article about, it was part of his dissertation on Paul Engel. Now, and Bennett himself is a graduate of the Iowa Workshop. Now, if you actually read the article, it's mostly, in my reading at least, he's a whiny upper-class white boy who's, it's all sour grapes about why isn't he a novelist? Because he came to Iowa with his brilliant intellectual ideas, and they only thought 3 types of writing were appropriate, and none of them were intellectual enough and abstract enough for him, and they wanted to turn everybody into muffins. And that's exactly what he said, muffins, muffins, muffins. So he ended up having to go become an academic, smallest violin in the world for him. But in doing this and in doing all his research on Engel, he turned up all this information on the history of the workshop. Now, you also, one of the interesting things too about Bennett is that he knew Engel personally. So that's another piece. To go back with this, to make this, to really give some background though, isn't just the writers. We have to go back to the 1950s and the Cold War. Yeah. The US, the Soviet Union, the Berlin Wall, John le Carré's iBooks, you know, MI5 agents in the communist bloc, kids have duck and cover drills in schools, just probably better than having computer drills, because there wasn't actually a war, but there almost was in 1963 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a really short story. But there was Spy versus Spy, and Rocky and Bullwinkle versus Natasha and Boris Badenov, and you know, it was constant. There was another war going on, more surreptitious one. It was called soft power, and that was culture war, cultural influence, where, and it was very much a program of the CIA to influence the Eastern Bloc, people there, to see American culture and to think that we're better, our values looked better, more positive, basically to sow some degree of dissent. So the CIA supported jazz music, specifically a lot of the big bands, but also people like Dizzy Gillespie. They also supported rock, hard rock even, much as that might be really hard to believe. Another one, Voice of America was playing this music, and it was playing it so that people, kids in the Eastern Bloc were listening to this music, which they didn't have access to otherwise. Art, abstract art, which was different from Soviet realist art. So Jackson Pollock, for example, was taking money from the CIA. Now, it wasn't that he was a sellout. He was just taking extra money for the stuff he would have done anyway. But he was being paid because the artists in the Soviet Union were very, I hope you can see the pictures here. Valorized. Industrial workers, and they were very limited in what they could do, which also meant that the people who cared about art were very limited in what they could see. And so having and supporting artists who were being more experimental was a way of showing the rest of the world and showing especially people whose lives were limited by the government restrictions what could be done. Well, it turned out that the musicians were really hard to control. Yeah, they just couldn't get the musicians to play along. I mean, they did play. They did send a few of the jazz bands on tours, but they couldn't get them to really behave themselves and to give off all the correct propaganda, as it were. Gee, big surprise. The rock bands were worse. Yeah, that's another big surprise. So, finally, they came to writers. The CIA didn't actually give money to Iowa until 1969. Oh, the last gasp of the music program. I love this bit. It's in an article in The Guardian. I will put a link to it later on. But the last gasp was 1989, right before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The CIA helped underwrite a concert by the Scorpions, hard metal band, right outside on the western side of the Berlin Wall, and they were blasting the music onto the east side. Now, it's kind of a little bit because the Scorpions are a German band, so they kind of had stake in the outcome of this. And they played another concert a year later after the fall of the Berlin Wall. But this was, we believe, the absolute end of that program. I still think it's hilarious myself. Anyway, we get back to literature, which the CIA hadn't done much about to that point. The thing is Paul Engel was the head of the Iowa Writers Workshop. Paul Engel was an ardent anti-communist. Bennett called him a do-it-yourself anti-communist. So he had an agenda himself as the head of the Writers Workshop, even before he got the CIA, even before the CIA gave I mean, Engel was kind of like Bennett. They shared a lot in common, in that they were both kind of disappointed. Engel had been in his 20s the rising star of poetry. He was the poet of the 20th century America. But he peaked really early and didn't fulfill that promise at all. So even though he kept afterwards trying and published some, all of his best work was behind him. It was very sad for him. But it turned out that he found his place as an administrator, and he was really good at fundraising, which of course is what we want administrators to do. But being a born-again cold warrior, he called himself that, actually, a cold warrior. He got major corporate backing for the Iowa Workshop. This is part of why it's so prestigious. With all of this super major backing from corporations, there was money, they could hire great faculty, they could also bring in the best students. Grad students go where they can survive. He had money. So even before the CIA put their dirty fingers into it, we have somebody with the super American vision, 1950s agenda, and going to corporations for money to support it. So this is where we've got a really heavy-duty political mix going that will create the background of what happens to what we call literature in all of basically mid-20th century on American writing. And I think in some ways really constricted it. Okay, so the thing that was different about Engel, the other people, musicians, artists, the CIA gave them money. They were performers, they were artists, they were single people. Where Engel is different is he had a school. He had students. And where Iowa is most influential is not only did it have produce many great writers. I mean, some of them truly are great. Some of them are considered great by the canon, by the dictates of the canon, which were in part created by the workshop. But these students are the ones who seeded almost every other writing program in the country. And their methodology, the writer's workshop, is the methodology by which all of us, everyone, is trained. From your first beginning undergrad class in creative writing through doing this throughout your whole professional career. Writers use the methodology that was created in the Iowa workshop, and we just go with it. It's like air we breathe. It's just, we don't question it. So it's a kind of double-edged sword in a lot of ways. Okay, I want to talk a little bit first about the canon and the way the canon was created. It's a real chicken and egg thing. Did the workshop methodology create the way we do things, or and the kinds of things it produced, or is what it produced create the methodology? Or, you know, nobody's going to figure that out, and it doesn't really matter. What matters is how do we work with it or fix it. But okay, anyway, if we look at American writing, what we call literature, okay, this is an interesting thing. Literature, what we call literature. This idea we have high culture, that's literature, the serious stuff, the stuff that gets reviewed by critics, not reviewers, in the New York Times and New York Review of Books, and the stuff, the important, serious stuff, not the trash. What they say like, what I write is trash for cash. As my dear colleague, one of my dear colleagues says, Esther Friesner, she's known for writing humorous science fiction, so she's good for coming up with those kind of quips. But yeah, we're looked down upon for that very specific type of thing. And part of this is if we look at the American fiction from the middle of the 1950s, the middle of the mid-20th century, down into the early aughts, it's kind of more of the same old, same old. You see very little real innovation, real breaking the mold, real different voices. There's a lot of flattening. First of all, one of the major tenets of this form of literature is that we write about the slice of life, the everyday, the quotidian. Nothing else will do. How does that serve this agenda? Well, what was every day, what was considered to be the appropriate slice of life for these writers is not a lot about the life that I've led. My background is very Dickensian. Nobody ever believed me. And it's not about the type of life that somebody from the lower class led. It's not about the kind of life that somebody with a disability has led or somebody of color has led. No. It's about, or even about the life of women. When I was a grad student in workshops, I was often the only woman in the group, and I had the men telling me that, no, people don't say that. People don't react like that to my female characters. Yeah. Because they were saying people meant white upper middle class men. That was it. So the whole slice of life stories is life about what they called real people, who was them. Okay. And you'll see, if you look at the list of who are the great writers, who are the great American writers of this period, you will notice that it's a huge number of white upper class men, cisgender, straight white men, I should point out too. There are very few, almost no other experiences reflected in this period. And some of this is because that's what was condoned, but that was also what was being pushed. In many ways, there was an underground. There were a lot of things like the Beats, but you don't see Kerouac in any of the lists I have perused for this talk. I have looked at lists and lists and lists of what are the great books, who are the great writers of the 20th century. And Kerouac was a white man, but somehow he's never included. Nope. It's always John Irving, Nabokov. How do you get to be American? Hemingway, of course, the ultimate manly man. It's all about independence and individualism. Everything is very, very geared towards the individual, which is pushing the agenda that they want to push and a ghettoization of everyone else. So obviously I have a lot of opinions about all of this, but you know, so why would this distinction of high literature and the other stuff, where do you draw the lines and why are those lines there, and the accepted preferences in prose? Well, Iowa, and Bennett goes into this, Iowa privileged three particular kinds of writing. The lean and mean Hemingway prose. That was the number one preference. Number two preference, the elegant and ornate Faulkner model. Now, the Hemingway model, the lean, pared down, crystalline, beautiful prose, reflects the ideal, the strong, the independent, masculine. I mean, come on, Hemingway was a total misogynist, among other things, that supposedly characterizes the American ideal. And this is what Engel would want to sell across to combat his idea of the whole Soviet notion, again, in his mind. The Faulkner-esque style does kind of similar things, although the prose is somewhat ornate. The characters are unique. They are still very individualistic. They can be a little more eccentric, a little bit more creative than the single determined Hemingway characters. And if you look at Hemingway's characters, they're really kind of all very similar. He doesn't have a huge range. The third type of Engel, Iowa fiction is magical realism. And what is magical realism? I have students all the time asking me, so how is that different from fantasy? Well, interesting. I think that magical realism is the one little thing that he put in to give an out for the people who are not permitted into the white, straight, cisgendered male paradigm, but who are too damn good to not write. Toni Morrison, Beloved, we can call magical realism, because it's certainly not a quotidian by Engel's viewpoint, but you can call it magical realism. So it was the little slide of out that he could give to people who did not fit the absolute paradigm, but who are just too talented to completely deny. But it still others them by calling it magical, putting in that, magic. And we can accept that from these other people because they don't live in quite the same reality, the hard world, and understand the world that we do the way we do. Because they don't have our American suburban white middle class experience. I'm trying very hard now not to swear. So be nice to me. I'm not using any language that has to be censored yet. But that their emotional lives, this is to say his standard white male quotidian stuff, their emotional lives were so subtle and important that those other people, we call them something else and we marginalize. So we put them into this other category called magical realism. Where is the slide between magical realism and fantasy? Where you put it on the shelf, where you put it on, what's science fiction versus literature. In a number of the lists I pursued, Ursula K. Le Guin comes up as a major literary writer. I would say that that's true, but she's the only one from, and they say, oh, well, science fiction writer. Like we've got our one token science fiction writer, because we had to figure out some girl to get in there somehow. But if you look at all of this, you'll see over and over and over again. So I looked at all these lists, and it's really interesting. Okay, Goodreads, list of the 100 best American books of the 20th century. Okay, so it's only Goodreads, but we're talking about a lot of people voting on this. And they're people who are readers, they identify as readers, and they're voting. So you don't get to James Baldwin till you get to number 50 on this list, okay? There are, count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Black writers on this list of 100. Only Toni Morrison has 2 books listed. The other 7 have only 1 book listed. Many of the white men, John Irving, good old all-American Nabokov, Theodore Dreiser, are listed many times. 3 Latinos, 2 Asian Americans out of 100. And you can say it's only Goodreads, so what? But other lists have the same distribution or worse. Okay, The Guardian, their great American novelist tournament, 32 books, has only 1 Black author, and it's Toni Morrison. Only 5 women. Great. So we can't just say that it just happened, that marginalization is a really serious problem. And I think a lot of it comes from this entire ideology that there are only these kinds of writing and that they reflect a specific man's point of view of the world. And the rest of us were considered not really people about what literature, what stories are supposed to look like, and what the daily life of an American is supposed to look like. So you end up with things happening like, at one point, an editor asked Toni Morrison, when are you going to start writing about normal people? I mean, how can you wrap your head around that? I can't. I absolutely can't. But Paul Engel had to show Russians how Americans lived their daily lives with swimming pools in every backyard. Here I'm referencing a John Irving short story. Eat steak, drive big cars, and go wherever the open road calls, to show that our lives were things that they wanted. So, and remember that these stories, our stories, the stories that we told and are telling, this is not just about literature and reading. These are the stories that we use. This is film, this is TV, this is gaming. One of the things I love about D&D is that you have a group on a campaign and that it works as a cooperative. There has to be a cooperative team as opposed to this saga of the individual against the world. It's starting to change now. We're working on it. We're starting to consciously try to make places for new stories and stories told in a different way from different voices. But we have to think about stories, what makes stories literary, what makes them good, and we have to think about it differently. I went to school in France for a while, and when I was there, I learned in France, there isn't this kind of huge wall between high culture and all the other stuff. There are stories. And we can like stories, we can compare stories, we can think about stories. It isn't comics are stupid and for little kids. We're just starting now to think about things like graphic novels and Mouse and Persepolis and some of the fine work that's being done in graphic form. But it's only very recently that anybody has even looked at this seriously. And again, science fiction, fantasy. I would contend that Samuel R. Delany, who is a science fiction writer, I mean, he still is, but he's getting quite elderly now, was one of the great voices of the 20th century. Brilliant, brilliant man, also brilliant essayist, great thinker. Nobody seems to recognize him outside of the speculative fiction world. But in France, you can talk about Mickey Mouse seriously, and you can talk about Proust as a beach read. And nobody will be surprised either way. It's perfectly reasonable. I'm not saying that just everything should be called great art, but that we have to think. I mean, I don't believe in everyone gets the participation now at all. But I think we've dug ourselves into a really, really deep rut. And we need to think about the whole thing differently. About the people the story is about and who's telling the stories. So that's the first wall we've got to break down. Only maybe it's the second wall, because it's like I said earlier, the whole chicken and egg thing. Like, can we break the mold if we don't change the training? And the training can hurt some people in some ways. And this really worries me because I teach creative writing. And it might surprise you that even at a place like MIT, we have not only a very active and nationally highly regarded creative writing program, but we also have a fair number of not white, straight, cisgendered students. I have a class right now where we only have one straight, white, cisgendered male. So that's not totally unusual for my classes. We have quite a diverse group there. So I really want to be able to these voices. I want the students to feel supported in how to find their authentic voice, to tell their stories, the stories that can tell them, and to really relish telling the stories that we really want to hear. Okay, so how do we do this? The Iowa method, I'm going to just tell you really quickly what it is. And then I want to throw it out to people so we have some time to talk a little bit, maybe brainstorm a little bit. The Iowa model, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I've revised things a bit for my classes. The Iowa model is pretty much the way I was trained, the way everyone is trained. You sit around in a circle. One person is the author. The author is not allowed to speak at all. Everyone goes around, everyone has prepared a critique of the story. Each person goes in turn and they give their critique. No one else is permitted to speak until the very end. The author gets to speak. If it's an open time, then people have as much time as they want. In something like a classroom setting, we're timed. And then if there's time, there's free discussion. I learned two things. First of all, in the Iowa method, people were actually encouraged to be really harsh with their critiques. And I have been in and I have seen workshop groups where that is the methodology. I don't permit that in my classes. But I also learned that this idea of the author must remain silent the whole time, and you can't ask the author a question or anything, is because in the Iowa school, you have a group of these very entitled young white men who are used to having everybody listen to them all the time. So in order to get them to be quiet and listen to other people speak, you had to have a rule that they weren't allowed to speak. Otherwise, they would start trying to talk over everyone and answer anybody's critique and tell them, no, you're wrong. That's where it came from. That was another shocker to me. So Engel had this system all in place when the CIA came in, loved what they saw, gave him not a huge pile of money, but enough more money that he could attract more students. And of course, like Bennett, even though Iowa has turned out many, many known writers, they've turned out many more people who became academics because they weren't able to get published. And so this particular methodology has now gone into, is not only mainstream, it is the methodology. I have changed my classes some. My students are, first of all, we're not allowed to be harsh. You're not allowed to talk about anything but the words on the page. We talk about how this is safe space and we are all here for each other. This is a social contract, and we are all here to help each other do the best work we can. And we must start with finding first the best, at least one strength of the piece, because everything has a strength. And this is a good exercise for the people doing the critiques too. The work and workshop is not just for people who are, for the authors being critiqued. It's actually extremely useful for the people writing their critiques, even though a lot of times they don't realize that at the time. I have started saying that an author may ask a question or direct people's attention to something they're uncertain about, either in writing before the workshop starts or at the beginning of their workshop. People can ask the writer a very short question, and that people can't say, this is wrong, this is bad, which was normal. That's completely normal. Or you should do it like this. The rules that I have set up are to say, I don't understand how this works. Could you clarify this point? I don't know why this happened. To put things in questions, mostly. You can ask for things like, I would like more descriptions. What does this character look like? What does this place look like? And because I teach genre, we're frequently in worlds that are not Earth, so, or we're in future Earth. So we have to describe a lot more. So, but it's always asking the author a question, and they don't answer right then because they're taking notes. But that's as far as I've gotten, pretty much. And I've been really working on trying to find more and more supportive ways. So now I was hoping people would have thoughts and ideas and comments and maybe some ideas for me to incorporate in my classes, but other thoughts about literature and high literature of the 20th century and all this other stuff. Please.
Yes, thank you for this marvelous presentation. It is an honor to have you presenting here in ARTIVISM. Before we go there to the discussion, I would just like to invite everyone back next Monday, October 28th, for Alex Tiranova, who will be presenting Activism, Art, and identity in the face of oppression. For
It's
more
It's
information,
not October 28th. Today is October 28th.
oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you see, good thing you're here. November 4th. That's right. Yes. Thank you. For more information on this and all the series past and upcoming events, please go to the website www.adelphi.edu/artivism. You can follow us also on Facebook, on Instagram at Artivism, the digit 4, Shared Humanity, or simply Google Artivism Initiative. Our YouTube channel is Artivism, again with the number 4, Shared Humanity. And if you'd like to get involved, present, be part of the initiative in any methods, there are various ways, please just send us an email. And again, yes, November 4th for Alex Sirenova's presentation this coming Monday. Okay, now there were a couple of questions already in the chat for you. One, let me just get back to it, was from Jim R, who says, can you go over the timeline again, please? You said CIA only started funding Iowa in '69. So
Yes.
this late that IWW Wartop writing?
Yes. Okay. What it is, well, the CIA actually started funding the Iowa Writers Workshop in '69. It was Paul Engel's agenda that aligned very much with the McCarthy anti-communism that steered the workshop agenda very much in line with the kind of soft power thing that the CIA wanted. I believe that it took the CIA a while to figure out that writers had anything to add to what they were seeing as American culture they could sell abroad, essentially. But Engel was putting this all over, and since his graduates, a number of his graduates were publishing very well-known work, it became very clear that there was influence. And that's when they started putting more money into it. Yeah. So it wasn't that the CIA actually was that active in the beginning. It's more Paul Engel, who was an ardent anti-communist who was pushing things in that direction. But let's face it, it was a cool title.
He also has a follow-up and says, and how does the talk about U.S. conformism from after World War II factor into U.S. writing?
Yeah.
And Jim, if you want to unmute yourself, please do so.
Thanks for the question out loud. I'm curious how she talks about that, and maybe I'll have a follow-up question later.
Okay. Anybody else? Any ideas? Anything anybody wants to say? Please.
We have another one from Felipe Vega that says, in a portion of your talk, he put this on the chat. And Felipe, you want to read it out loud or say it and tell us what you were thinking?
Oh, this was a short comment on how to, well, I am now with the banners for harmonic intelligence instead of critical intelligence, because critical intelligence, it comes from a German perspective of 100 years old, and it also has this restricted topic section, a marginalized formula or marginalizer formula for topics that are not like part of their agenda, as you mentioned, or are not cult oriented in that perspective. So that was a nice thing that your sessions add up, right? The distinctive appreciative intelligence when in which you also observe the model in a distinct manner. This is pretty amazing. But my comment is a little deeper because it goes back to history as well. So back in the perhaps 70s and 80s, the natural language processing studies, back in those days, it was called neuro-linguistic programming, and it was studied in the IBM processing, facilities. So they discovered this new psychology that in the 80s was decided to be separated into wise knowledge and taught knowledge. This separation was, well, a similar thing of what occurred throughout the ages, right? So I found that even nowadays we have difficulties as publishers, for example, of topics. In my case, regarding the music of the spheres, I received this marginalization of calling it, magical thinking, or this they use when the paradigm doesn't fit, and Shariann mentioned it brightly. This is very classic. So I would like to learn a little bit more about this set of topics, and perhaps to relate it to the present. For example, I see this book Imminent written down, as top thing, right? Like regarding the discussion of um, alien life, and they claim that it is always a negative possibility, right? Contact is always a negative possibility, and therefore it must be militarized, right? So I wonder if all of this is connected into this mm,
I,
perspective you show us.
I do have to say, in science fiction, we do not at all say that alien contact is always negative or must be militarized. And that was very much an earlier phase. And now I think we are having a lot more story that goes into a much more inclusive and um, learning writing. We are trying to be more understanding and get rid of that perspective. I mean, not everyone, clearly, but that is something that is happening in science fiction these days. The problem is, of course, you have to seek out certain types of science fiction. And it's become a very large field. Unfortunately, the movies have a very militaristic, or tend towards the militaristic, I guess because it makes for lots of CGI. And in gaming, a lot of games have a tendency to go in that direction. Although I've just met some people in our CMS program, comparative media studies, where they're doing a lot with cooperative gaming now, which is really cool. But no, science fiction is not all about that. Although I'm really interested in a lot of the other ideas you're talking about, with using the neural programming and wisdom intelligence and stuff. I'd like to know if you have any ideas about how that can be more incorporated.
Into a classroom session, I do have more ideas because
Yes,
I put them into practice a lot. But
yes,
yeah,
talk,
yeah, we can.
please.
It's very interesting, and so again, looking at the literature, we see that from 2013 on, it was militarized, and they do not talk about neurolinguistic programming anymore, but it is all known as natural language processing. Nevertheless, I do have tools I have put into practice and experimented for a while, so I'll be happy to share them with you.
Oh, if you would, I would be so grateful. Thank you. Thank you.
And Jim has a question also, or follow-up.
Yeah, a question, but just I guess there are two things with NLP. There's natural language processing, which is one thing, and then neural linguistic programming. One of the things, so those people were looking and modeling some powerful, like Virginia Satir, who was a really incredible therapist, and Milton Erickson, who was a pioneer of a modern hypnotherapy. So they were looking at communicators and then like modeling. I was wondering if you could say a little more about like kind of going back a little bit in time where you have like, you know, I was thinking about someone like Virginia Woolf. I just saw a new musical about Orlando the other day. So, you know, like kind of after World War II, excuse me, after World War One, values are being challenged and whatnot. She talks about a room of one's own. So, you know, later, you know, in France, we have that idea of écriture féminine. And then, after that, the idea of like getting past like kind of traditional binaries. But so if you could talk a little bit about, so, you know, with modernism, you know, again, after this World War One and whatnot, and then just the idea about like let's say about multicultural writing. I know a lot of people that are older than me that taught that a lot, like with a lot of different novels, you know, how you saw that coming into the United States. And then when people talk about, again, before my time, about the switch from the switch more towards voicey writers and more like kind of the voice of the writer instead of the more stiff formal writing that might have been before. I'm trying to think when the shift happens, but you know, they talk about like, for example, like you know, like certain Jewish writers and, you know, other writers, like how there's a shift to more voiciness, and your take on that and how that should be thought about in a way. And then, sorry, lastly, so one of your main challenges against like kind of hero's journey, it sounds like, kind of that's so popularized, that has good things about it, but so you're kind of sick of that idea of that individual hero in their story, or he or her or whatnot, and that being part of the problem.
Okay.
Sorry, threw a lot out there.
Ooh, lots, lots and lots of things. Okay, first, hero's journey. I do teach that, but I talk about it from a completely Jungian point of view. And I've talked to students about how all of those pieces of the hero's journey are in fact Jungian archetypes, and the appeal is really about how we're teaching people to go on this journey about themselves, and it's self-discovery. And we don't have to think of story as structured very specifically as the hero's journey. There are people who are turning it into this, you plug in all these pieces to make it a story, which is horrific.
Right. Yeah.
And you have this person does this at this point, blah, blah, blah. It's horrible. But to look at it in terms of, think about the psychological implications of what is happening as your characters, and not just one character, but every character has to have an arc in story. Every character has to grow. Every character has to change, or it's not interesting. And so the hero's journey is really the journey within the journey of maturation that everybody goes through. And by the way, it's not just a young person's journey, that people are constantly learning and maturing throughout their whole lives. This is happening. So I try and take it out of that context of, you have to do these particular things, and there has to be, you know, there has to be the call to adventure, then they resist the call, and blah, 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 blah. And take that all away, and let's look at this from a very different point of view, because I do believe in arc of character. I do believe it's important to follow a character learning and changing and growing. I do think that that is part of the heart of a story.
Sure. Sure, if I could just start at the sorry, the second one. So when people talk about like the idea that maybe there was this conformity in America and then there was a change in terms of a little bit with writers being more voicey, challenging the stiffness that certain texts were after like a conformism in America, there was more voiciness. I just love if you could say your take on that. Maybe that was like in how that's played out over the years, like how important that is in the balance. You know what I mean?
I think what you're calling voicey has always been a minority. There have been a lot of people who, it's actually come around again. Just recently, Zora Neale Hurston has become rediscovered yet again.
Sure.
But it's always been a small number of writers who have been in that quote unquote voicey category. And partly, I think, because it's very hard to do. And it takes a very specific type of writer to do it. Partly because it's challenging for a reader. And it's kind of like, I think of it like eating truffles, like really super rich truffles. You don't want to eat a whole box of them at once. You can't eat that for like a whole day, like that's going to be the only thing you eat. You have one or maybe two, and then you need something like salad and, chickpeas. And tomorrow you can have another truffle. And I think that that there is so much depth and so much richness there that sometimes it can be a little overwhelming or challenging if it's not completely you. I mean, there are some people for whom that is totally what they read and that's what they love, but it's a minority and it's a minority preference. That's my feeling about it. It always has been. And the idea of saying we think that, oh, wow, this is a major thing happening because a few books come out and they get a lot of attention, but then they're in the zeitgeist and we're not seeing how many other things are all over the place and people are aware of them. You see what I mean? Is that making sense?
Sure. Yeah, I was just kind of wanting to hear kind of more of your analyses. So interesting in terms of some of the problematics, from Iowa and like kind of constrictions put on writing and like I'm just kind of curious about how like your vision of how the path could go where there's like a better balance and a better situation.
Well, the path to go is I'm looking for it really hard. I think I don't want to throw out all of the idea of workshop because I think it can be good and supportive and helpful for people. I think that it can give a writer a great deal. I think that we need not just to give lip service. There's a lot of lip service. I see this all over the place. If you look on wish list, agents and editors wish list, it's a website. Anybody can go on it. And they're all saying they're all looking all the time for work by people of color and queer people and trans people. They're constantly looking for that. You know how much is getting published? Not that much. So what do we have to do to change things like right down at the bottom level? What needs to happen? How can we get, first of all, to support people's voices and good writers? I mean, we're not talking about just anyone. but people who are really good, get them trained so that they can do justice to their visions without hurting them. And then to have an audience who is open to reading and to an array of stories. And that's across the board. I mean, I have heard of people who have been marginalized who only want to read stories by people who are like them about people who are like them. And I can understand it. If you're from a marginalized group, I can totally understand wanting that. But on the other hand, we have to be larger than that. And we have to work on that. How that can happen, for me, okay, I'm a genre writer. I write fantasy, I write science fiction, I write about things that don't and can't happen. I write about talking ravens and generation ships hundreds and thousands of years in the future, okay? And genetic engineering and all kinds of stuff. So in that stuff, the stuff that happens, I think I have a pretty broad imagination. I should, and I try very hard to imagine myself into other situations, into people who are not anything like me. And I have sensitivity readers. I pay people who are of marginalized groups to read over my work and make sure that I have not messed up. At least not too badly, I hope. Because that's the best I can do. I can support my students in their quest. And again, that's the best I can do. I don't know what else.
I'll tell you what else. We need a part 2 to this.
Oh, sorry.
Else, definitely. This is, I have one quick question. You talked about high literature, right? What would an example be of high literature and then its counterpart, which would be low literature? What is considered low?
Oh, most of the stuff I write, science fiction, come on, fantasy. Some of it's really good too. Some of it should be, okay. Dahlgren by Samuel R. Delany is not considered high literature, but it should be. I think it's probably going to be one of the, 200 years from now, people are going to realize it was one of the great books of the 20th century. When people have forgotten Lolita. But it's brilliant. But now, it's that science fiction stuff. Low culture, anything with a spaceship on it. Dune, iRobot, anything with robots. Arthur C. Clarke. Now, there is a wonderful, brilliant writer who does some amazing things. Childhood's End. What a stellar book. And yes, the pun is intended. Sorry. But it's really worth reading, and it's short. It's really short. You can probably read it in an afternoon. Brilliant book, but no, it's science fiction, so it's a junk novel. But high literature, anything by Hemingway. Now read Arthur C. Clarke and Hemingway side by side. Really, I'm serious about this. The French version just completely opened my eyes in such an amazing way. I mean, in loads and loads of ways, but this was yet another way that school in France just completely blew my brain to smithereens wonderfully.
And I think also the question is, what is defining those terms? Because at the end, is it sales? Is it the critics, like you said, or the peer reviews? Is it just people that know people, right? Because we have come across many just categorization and terminology that is basically what defines things, right? And those definitions can be redefined because from the get-go, they have been defined to favor some demographics over others, right? Therefore, the bottom line is, what is literature? Is it more the stylistics style, the
Yeah, yeah. Who
innovation
defines
in
it?
the actual language?
Academics,
Right? What is
academics,
it, right?
critics.
Or is it just on the name, right?
It certainly isn't sales, because then Stephen King and Anne Rice would be the greatest literary proponents. And I think Anne Rice is like not so good. Stephen King is a much better writer than I think he's given credit for, frankly. But if you sell too much, if your books sell way too well, then a lot of times you're not considered that good a writer. Or if you write too fast, if you write too many books, you can't be that good, right? So, but usually it's been academics and critics, the kind of high critics, the critics who write the long critical articles for the New York Review of Books and such.
Oh, no, yes, definitely. And what I was saying is also that we're viewing it from a writer's perspective. Now we also have to see it from an audience perspective.
Yes, for sure, the test of time. I did really appreciate when you talked about your workshops and having the circle of students also focusing on a positive.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't boring, at least.
Not at all, not at all. Carolina,
It is so.
Thank you.
Carolina just got disconnected, but she'll be back on. But I wanted to thank you. We'll wait another minute or two for Carolina to come on. There she is. Yes. Yes, Carolina.
I'm back again.
Yes. Yes, it's the connection, Carolina. You're zooming out again. But I will thank you until Carolina's connection is a little bit better. Thank you, Shariann.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for asking me.
At ARTIVISM, at the end of each presentation, we ask the presenter for their takeaway. What would your key takeaway be for today's presentation? What do you want to leave us with?
So many things, for so much learning I still can do, and so many new ideas that I have, and people who I hope I can continue to have dialogues with and learn from. That would be the best part. Is that okay?
That's perfect. Thank you. Carolina, are you able to zoom back in?
Yes, I want to turn my video on to see if maybe that will help the connection. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you
Yes.
better now.
Yes, no.
Shariann.
Okay, perfect. No, thank you.
Shariann did her takeaway.
Yes, yes.
Would you like to close, Carolina?
Yes, yes. I would like to thank Professor Aguilarakis, also Sing for Hope, and Teachers College, Columbia University, the Gottesman Libraries, for their support, as well as Adelphi. Again, we're in season 8 of Artivism, and we look forward to seeing and connecting with all of you for the upcoming events, such as the one next Monday. Also, there is an opening for a poster design and an exhibition in the spring. Therefore, please just check out the website and participate if you like on those potential endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in today.
Thank you.
you.
Be well, everyone.